My name is Kyle Tequila, host of the shocking new true crime podcast, Crook County.
I got recruited into the mob when I was 17 years old.
People are dying. Is he doing this every night?
Kenny was a Chicago firefighter who lived a secret double life as a mafia hitman.
I had a wife and I had 2 children. Nobody knew anything.
He was a crazy man.
He was my father, and I had no idea about any of this until now. Listen to Crook County on America's #1 podcast network, iHeart. Open your free iHeart app and search Crook County to start listening.
While not from here, their connection to the city is undeniable, and Chicago's influence most certainly contributed to their rise as one of the most successful musical acts of all time. Today we're talking about the Jackson 5. I'm Tommy Henry, and this is the Chicago History Podcast. The idea behind this episode came about during a Chicago Architecture Center Open Chicago event a few years back. If you're not familiar with Open Chicago, one weekend a year, usually in October, the Chicago Architecture Center works with various locations around the city to invite guests to explore places they may not have access to otherwise. Churches, synagogues, theaters, Walt Disney's boyhood home, private clubs, banks, hundreds of other locations. I get giddy just thinking about it. One of the locations that is often part of Open Chicago is the Central Park Theater, located on Roosevelt Road in the Lawndale neighborhood on the city's west side. Originally opened in 1917 as an 1,800-seat cinema, it has the distinction of being the first effort in a partnership between cinema developers Balaban & Katz and the architectural firm Rapp & Rapp, a collaboration which gave rise to numerous Chicago landmarks, including the Chicago Theater, the Oriental Theater, now known as the Nederlander, the Riviera, and the Uptown Theater. After years of operating as a cinema and performing arts venue, the Central Park Theater became a church in 1971. During the Open Chicago tour, someone mentioned the Jackson 5 had performed there back in the day. Now, I could not quite wrap my mind around that and needed to find out more about it. This became a deep dive into more of the Jackson 5 Chicago connections, including the dates, places, and info about all of those places. Oh, I'm not going to go into any of the parenting choices of Joe and Catherine Jackson. Okay, maybe one or two, or any of the legal troubles of the Jackson family members. There are plenty of books and documentaries available about those. Just over the border into Indiana, roughly 25 miles southeast of Chicago, lies Gary, a city founded in 1906 by the U.S. Steel Works as the home for its new Gary Works plant. So connected to this industry was this new city that it was named after lawyer Albert Henry Gary, who was the founding chairman of the United States Steel Corporation. Thanks mainly to the numerous steel industry jobs in the area, Gary's population grew rapidly over the next few decades, and at its peak in 1960, the city was home to nearly 180,000 residents. In a residential neighborhood in Gary at 2300 Jackson Street is a 672-square-foot two-bedroom home that was built in 1949 during the post-industrial boom. Jackson Street in Gary was named for President Andrew Jackson. The future patriarch of the Jackson family, Joe Jackson, was born and raised in Fountain Hill, Arkansas. After his parents divorced, he moved with his father to Oakland, California. At age 18, Joe Jackson moved to East Chicago, Indiana to be closer to his mother and to pursue his dreams of becoming a boxer. Joe Jackson moved to Gary, Indiana in 1949 when he accepted a job at Inland Steel in East Chicago, working as a crane operator from 4 p.m. to midnight. He soon met Catherine Scroose shortly after he arrived in Gary, and the two married and settled into their new home on Jackson Street in January of 1950. Their first child, Maureen, who later went by her nickname Breeby, was born in May of that year. The couple would go on to have 10 children total, including son Marlon's twin, who died at childbirth. Joe Jackson reportedly averaged less than $65 a week in the early 1960s. According to Jackson biographers, few school pictures of the Jackson siblings exist because the family couldn't afford to buy them. J. Randy Taraborrelli, author of the 2009 book Michael Jackson, The Magic, the Madness, The Whole Story, 1958 to 2009, described the living situation as: Catherine and Joseph shared one bedroom with a double bed. The boys slept in the other bedroom in a triple bunk bed. Tito and Jermaine sharing a bed on top, Marlon and Michael in the middle, and Jackie alone on the bottom. The three girls slept on a convertible sofa in the living room, and when Randy was born, he slept on a second couch. In the bitter cold winter months, the family would huddle together in the kitchen in front of the open oven. Taraborrelli's book includes the following from Michael Jackson about growing up in the house. Quote, "Our family's house in Gary was tiny, only 3 rooms really, but at the time it seemed much larger to me. When you're that young, the whole world seems so huge that a little room can seem 4 times its size. When we went back to Gary years later, we were all surprised at how tiny that house was. I had remembered it as being bigger, but you could take 5 steps from the front door and you'd be out the back. It was really no bigger than a garage, but when we lived there it seemed fine to us kids. You see things from a different perspective when you're young." Joe Jackson, who played guitar, and Catherine, a singer and pianist, led their children in singing songs around the house. Michael Jackson once claimed, "We were a family that sang all the time." A key moment in what would become part of the history of the Jackson 5 occurred when son Tito Jackson was caught playing Joe Jackson's guitar, which was off limits from the children. After finding out Tito had broken a string, Joe Jackson demanded Tito show him what he could do with the guitar. This incident led to the formation of the Jackson Brothers in 1963, featuring Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine. By 1965, Joe Jackson added younger brothers Marlon and Michael to the group. In 1965, the Jackson Brothers went on stage at Gary, Indiana's Roosevelt High School to perform My Girl, made famous by the Temptations, winning the local talent show. It was at the Big Top department store at Broadway and 53rd Street on August 9th, 1965, Michael Jackson's 7th birthday, that the brothers performed Doin' the Jerk at a fashion show at the store. It was before this event that local promoter Evelyn Leahy, who also hosted the event, suggested to Joe Jackson that they change the name of the group from the Jackson Brothers to the Jackson 5. I couldn't find much about the Big Top department store, although current maps show 53rd and Broadway as being just south of Gary city limits in Merrillville, Indiana. It does not appear the Big Top department store made it much past the late 1960s. A citywide talent contest was held in 1966 with another win for the boys, and in 1967 the Jackson 5 won first prize at an amateur talent show at Gary's Memorial Auditorium. Memorial Auditorium was a 5,000-seat public auditorium that was commissioned by the Gary Land Company, part of the United States Steel Corporation, and was completed in 1927. It was dedicated to residents who died fighting in World War I. The 4-story Memorial Auditorium hosted political rallies, boxing tournaments, and an annual citywide music festival. Frank Sinatra performed there in November of 1945 in an effort to convince white high school students striking against integration to return to school, an event that made national news and even Life magazine. Sinatra called it, quote, "the most shameful incident in the history of American education." Sinatra told the packed auditorium of teens and parents that believing other races were inferior was a pillar of Nazism. Quote, "You don't know what you're missing, not being friends, playing together, visiting each other's families, sticking up for each other," Sinatra said. "Other kids in other centers don't have things like you have. Educational advantages especially. You're throwing them away." Sinatra was unsuccessful in his efforts to halt the walkout, but the negative publicity was a strong motivator for officials to take action in Gary. It would be nearly another decade before school segregation became illegal in 1954 in the United States, and even longer until it was properly enforced nationwide. Senator Robert F. Kennedy addressed a full house at the Gary Memorial Auditorium on April 15, 1968, just 7 weeks before his assassination. The Municipal Auditorium was closed in 1972, with the building added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1994. After the interior was destroyed during a fire in 1997, it was removed from the register, and the building was demolished in 2020. With the success of local talent shows under their belts, Joe Jackson began booking the Jackson 5 at venues around Gary and in South Chicago. And by venues, I mean any cocktail lounge and bar that would take them. After hours of playing shows at Gary night spots like Mr. Lucky's Lounge and Chicago nightclubs like Span's Burning Spear and the Confidential Club, these lads had developed into a professional unit ready to take their next step. In July of 1967, the Jackson brothers returned to Chicago for a recording session at Tone Studios, located in the One Durfo Records building at 1827 South Michigan Avenue along Chicago's Record Row. This session had been all but forgotten until 2009, when local guitarist Larry Blasingame brought it to the attention of Jake Austin, a writer for the Chicago Reader newspaper. Austin had been researching a story about a different Jackson 5 release, one on Steeltown Records. Steeltown Records was a short-lived record label out of Gary, Indiana, but Jackson fans know the Steeltown name for the key reason that Steeltown released the very first record from the Jackson 5. According to the Steeltown Records website, Steeltown founder Gordon Keith signed the Jackson 5 to a 6-month management and recording contract at the time when not one of the many local record labels saw their potential. After their first recording session didn't amount to anything, the Jackson 5 tried their hand at recording again in November of that year at Sonny Sawyer's Morrison Sound Studio on West 69th Street in South Chicago. The five brothers, Jackie, 16 at the time, Tito, 14, Jermaine, 12, Marlon, 10, and Michael, just 9, recorded Big Boy, a song written by saxophonist Eddie Silvers, who at that time was playing in a group called the Soul Merchants and working as music director for Chicago R&B label Wonderful Records. On the B-side, You've Changed, written by Jesse Reese. In the same session, the group recorded We Don't Have to Be Over 21 by Sherman Nasbury and Some Girls Want Me for Their Lover. Big Boy was released as a single in January of 1968, receiving radio airplay and selling close to 60,000 copies in the tri-state area. The regional success of Big Boy made such an impression that Jerry Wexler, executive vice president of Atlantic Records, reportedly sought out Gordon Keith and signed a contract with him on March 5th to Atco, a division of Atlantic Records, to distribute Big Boy nationally. Atlantic Records, Atco in New York pressed and distributed several thousand copies of Big Boy with the Steeltown label and Atco record sleeves. Producer-executive Jerry Wexler produced 14 albums with Aretha Franklin during the late 1960s and early 1970s, and also produced other notable artists like Wilson Pickett, working on hits such as In the Midnight Hour, and was instrumental in signing British band Led Zeppelin to a recording contract. Unfortunately, the release of Big Boy on Atco Records was not critically or commercially successful, and that deal soon fizzled. On Valentine's Day 1968, the Jackson 5 played at the Apollo Theater in New York, one of their biggest engagements outside of Chicago up until that point. They would return in May of that same year to play 7 consecutive nights from May 24th through the 31st. then back to the Chicago area for a 6-night run at the Capitol Theater at 79th and Halsted in the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood. The Capitol Theater, which opened in 1925, was designed by architect John Eberson, who also designed the long-gone Paradise Theater at 231 North Pulaski, and the Avalon Theater, now known as the New Regal Theater, which is still standing at East 79th and South Stony Island Avenue. The Capitol Theater was still showing movies until the mid-1970s, when it shuttered. The decaying building was demolished in 1985, and as of August 2024, nearly 40 years later, it is still an empty lot. Throughout April and May of 1968, the Jackson 5 played at the Guys and Gals Club at 848 West 69th Street near Halsted. The Guys and Gals Lounge opened in December of 1965, and although they booked plenty of name acts over the years, by 1973, they were shuttered due to non-payment of taxes. Benefit shows appeared to have done little to change their fortunes. The Jackson 5, with Johnny Jackson, no relation, on drums, returned to Chicago to perform at the Regal Theater at 47th and what was then South Parkway, now Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, in July of 1968 for a 10-day run with their song We'll Always Love You. Michael Jackson was 6 weeks shy of his 10th birthday for those shows. Also appearing on the bill for those shows were the Vibrations, the Esquires, and the Artistics. It was during this time that Joe Jackson and Motown Records founder Berry Gordy worked on the first year-long contract with the Jackson 5, a move that paved the way for their unbelievable success. Oh, almost forgot. The Jackson 5's appearance at the Central Park Theater, the one on the west side that helped inspire this episode, was on Saturday, August 10th and Sunday, August 11th of 1968, supporting headliner Jerry Butler with shows at 2 p.m., 6 p.m., and 10 p.m. The schedule might explain the next booking, also on Sunday, August 11th, when the Jackson 5 performed at the Guys and Gals Cocktail Lounge and Restaurant at 11:30 p.m. In case it was tough to follow, that's 3 shows during the day on the west side on a Sunday, followed by a 13-mile drive to the south side for an 11:30 p.m. show. Keep in mind that lead singer Michael Jackson was 2 weeks shy of his 10th birthday for this show that began at 11:30 at night on a Sunday. Bonkers. August 6, 1968, the boys were back at Guys and Gals Cocktail Lounge on West 69th Street for a Sunday night show. Well, technically Monday morning, as the show was advertised for a 12:30 a.m. start. Michael Jackson had turned 10 years old just 5 weeks earlier. The Jackson 5 performed at the Regal Theater in Chicago in November of 1968 for their big Thanksgiving show. Billed as 7 big days, starting Thursday, November 18th, they were one of 6 acts supporting the headliner, 18-year-old Stevie Wonder. A little background on the Regal Theater. It opened in 1928 in Chicago's historic Bronzeville neighborhood as part of the Lubliner and Trins theater circuit. With its blend of Moorish, Spanish, and Far Eastern stylings and leather seats, the Regal's capacity was nearly 3,000. The Regal Theater, along with the Savoy Ballroom just down the street, was part of what was called the Harlem of Chicago for its social and cultural contributions to the black community in the city. While most major Chicago theaters only hired blacks for custodial and behind-the-scenes jobs, the Regal was staffed primarily with African-American management, ushers, house musicians, and more. Over the years, the Regal Theater welcomed Count Basie, Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, John Coltrane, Aretha Franklin, and others. Nat King Cole, a Bronzeville resident, reportedly got his start at one of the popular amateur night contests held at the Regal. During the Depression, attendance at the Regal slipped and the venue's owners considered closing it. But thanks to an outcry by the community, the Regal stayed open, showing films and hosting popular stage reviews until the late 60s, finally closing for good at the end of 1968. After talk of the building being sold to a developer for a department store that never materialized, a mysterious fire broke out at the former Regal in 1971, and the Regal was demolished 2 years later. While researching this, I read many times that the Harold Washington Cultural Center was built on the site of the old Regal Theater, but according to my calculations, the Regal was actually where the parking lot, just to the south of the Cultural Center, stands today. Before the end of the year, the Jackson 5 returned to the south side to play at the High Chaparral at 7740 South Stony Island Avenue. The High Chaparral, roughly 23 miles from the Jackson home in Gary, was in operation in the late 1960s through the early 1970s and welcomed performers such as Duke Ellington and his orchestra, B.B. King, Ray Charles, the Chi-Lites, and Chaka Khan. Various live albums were recorded at the High Chaparral, including the 1973 release from the band War, recorded on November 25, 1972. The Jacksons were back in Chicago performing at the High Chaparral on March 7th, 8th, and 9th of 1969 as part of a battle of groups, billed in ads in the Chicago Defender newspaper as Billy Taylor's new High Chaparral and Midwest's largest nightclub. The Jackson 5 were joined by the Radiants from Chicago, the Crystal Generations, also from Chicago, the Marvelows from Chicago Heights, the Budlanders from South Suburban Robbins, Illinois, and all the way from Washington, D.C., the Four Bars. April and May of 1969 saw numerous appearances in the Chicago area by the Jackson 5. From April 25th through May 1st, the boys performed at the Metropolitan Theater, later known as the Met, at 46th and King Drive, supporting headliner the Delphonics from Philadelphia. On the same bill was the Chi-Lites, Evanston, Illinois' Josephine Taylor, who recorded a handful of singles for Chicago's Mar V. Luss Records in the late 1960s, Bronzeville's Renaldo Domino and the Soul Crusaders Orchestra, cool name, with Carl Wright as MC. Carl Wright was a tap dancer, actor, and comedian who later appeared in films such as Soul Food, Big Mama's House, and 2 of the Barbershop movies. Formed in 1959 at Hyde Park High School in Chicago, the Chi-Lites signed with local label Brunswick Records in 1968. 1 year later, their song Give It Away became their first R&B top 10 hit. Between 1969 and 1974, the Chi-Lites scored 11 top 10 singles on Billboard's R&B charts, including Have You Seen Her in 1971, their first million-selling record, and Oh Girl in 1972, which hit number 1 on the pop charts and became their second million seller. The 1,600-seat Metropolitan Theater opened in 1917 at 46th and South Parkway, later renamed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Drive, as a cinema catering to the neighborhood's middle-class Irish, German, and Jewish residents. After World War I ended, the demographics of the neighborhood shifted as blacks from the South came to Chicago looking for better opportunities. That theater, staffed with all-white employees, was often at odds with its black clientele. After a black patron filed a discrimination complaint against the theater with the NAACP, theater owners changed their hiring practices. In the 1920s, the Metropolitan, in addition to showing films, began booking jazz artists of the day. Much as it happened with other venues of the area, diminishing attendance began to show in the theater's upkeep. Known in its later days as simply the Met, it showed second-run and exploitation films before closing in the early 1980s. The city ordered its demolition in 1997. Last I was down that way, there is a big open lot where that theater once stood. One other venue I read the Jackson 5 performed at during their early years was the Green Bunny Lounge at 7710 South Halsted. Earl Calloway, the arts editor for the Chicago Defender newspaper, mentioned this in a few columns, but as hard as I looked, I couldn't find anything about the Jackson 5 playing at this venue. 3 days later, the group was back on the South Side performing at the Guys and Gals Club on May 4th and onto the High Chaparral on May 9th, 10th, and 11th. One local appearance slightly out of the ordinary around this time was at the end of August in 1969 when the Jackson 5 performed at Gilroy Stadium as part of Gary's Festival, along with a host of other Motown artists, including Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, Bobby Taylor, and the Vancouvers. In late 1969, just as the Jackson 5 was starting to really take off, Motown founder Berry Gordy rented a house for them in West Hollywood in Los Angeles at 1601 Queens Road. The 3,000-square-foot, 3-bed, 4-bath property had been built in 1927. Up until then, Joe Jackson and the boys were living in various area hotels, while Catherine, LaToya, Randy, and Janet stayed behind in Gary. Michael Jackson had spent the previous month staying with Diana Ross. According to Jackson biographer J. Randy Taraborrelli, the Jacksons' new living room alone was twice the size of their entire house back in Gary. Now, for those of you out west who know the neighborhood or are just nosy like me, the last time this house sold was in 1977 for $150,000, roughly $800,000 adjusted for inflation. Based on current housing data, estimates for the home's current value put it at $2.8 million. Writer Earl Calloway's column in the October 17, 1970 Chicago Defender titled "The Jackson 5 Offers Advice to Ease Nation's Drug Problem" included 19-year-old Jackie Jackson's suggestion that, quote, youth should try to avoid drugs. They should try to accomplish something to keep themselves busy. One way is to develop hobbies. In the same article, Michael, who was 12 at the time, was quoted as saying, "It will be wonderful being back in Chicago again. I remember singing around at the Capitol, the Guys and Dolls, the Regal, and other community programs in Gary and Chicago. I would be glad to see Chicago again." Jermaine Jackson, 15 at the time, said, "Chicago is a nice and groovy place, and I still haven't forgotten the people and the way people would come and hear us." In October of 1970, the Jackson 5 performed 2 concerts at 3 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. at the International Amphitheater at 42nd and Halsted in Chicago. By the beginning of 1971, the group had sold more than 12 million records and were the only artist to twice unseat the Beatles from their number 1 position on the charts. Billboard magazine ranked them the number 1 group in the world for their single record sales category for 1970, topping Elvis, Creedence Clearwater Revival, and others with 4 number 1 hits, I Want You Back, ABC, The Love You Save, and I'll Be There. They had become the fastest-selling recording group in Motown history. On January 31st, 1971, the Jackson 5 returned to Indiana for the first time since moving to California to play 2 benefit concerts at Gary's West Side High School for Mayor Richard Hatcher's re-election campaign. Flown from O'Hare Airport to Gary by a Chicago Helicopter Airways chopper emblazoned with "Welcome Home Jackson 5" on the side, the helicopter landed on the football field where they were welcomed by 3,000 fans and friends. Inside the school, more than 15,000 fans were crowded together to hear the Jackson 5 perform. They received the key to the city, and a ceremony was held outside their former home at 2300 Jackson Street, which was renamed Jackson 5 Boulevard for the day. A sign was placed on the lawn in front of the house that read, "Welcome Home Jackson 5, Keepers of the Dream." The event was filmed for a TV special. In July of 1971, the Jackson 5 once again performed at the International Amphitheater. Another indication that Jackson 5 mania was in full swing was in 1971 when the animated series Jackson 5, with the number 5 in place of the F, premiered on ABC as part of the network's Saturday morning cartoon series. The fictionalized portrayal of the group, produced by Rankin Bass and Motown Productions, ran for 2 seasons and has the distinction of making the Jackson 5 the first black group to have their own weekly animated series. ABC aired the first Jackson 5 TV special in September of 1971, titled Going Back to Indiana. The special included the group performing a few of their hits and acting in skits with guests Bill Cosby and the Smothers Brothers. It also showed footage of their celebration in Gary the previous January. That October 10th, the Jackson 5 gave a concert at the Black Expo held at the International Amphitheater in Chicago. 5 days later, they returned for another concert at the amphitheater. By 1972, the Jackson 5 was still riding high on their success. Large venues like the Rosemont Horizon were still 8 years away, so when the Jackson 5 came to Chicago, it was often to that International Amphitheater. The group would return here in July of 1972 for multiple shows, and then in September of that year as part of the Save the Children charity during the Black Expo Festival, organized in association with Jesse Jackson's Operation Push, People United to Save Humanity. Jackson 5 returned to Chicago in July of 73 to perform on the 24th and 25th of that month at the International Amphitheater. The following year, in June of 1974, the Jackson 5 performed for the first time at the Mill Run Theater in north suburban Niles, Illinois, for 9 shows across a 7-day run from the 22nd through the 30th. I speak with quite a few people around the Chicago area who are not familiar with the Mill Run, so here goes. The Mill Run Playhouse, also known as the Mill Run Theater, was a 1,600-seat theater in the round built in 1965 at the north end of the Golf Mill Shopping Center at Milwaukee and Gulf Roads. Originally a venue for off-Broadway shows, it was not successful and closed after a few short years. In 1969, a new group of investors, which included Sammy Davis Jr., leased the theater from the shopping center owners. The new concept was to bring in acts for longer runs similar to Las Vegas shows. Debuting on Tuesdays, acts would do a show a night during the week and 1 or 2 on Friday and 2 on Saturdays and Sundays. The first act to perform was comedian Shecky Green in early 1970, and the last was Diana Ross in 1984. In between, the Mill Run hosted shows from The Band, Kool and the Gang, The Mamas and the Papas, Johnny Cash, Rick Springfield, Tina Turner, Tom Waits, Casey and the Sunshine Band, Dolly Parton, and countless others. The Mill Run closed in 1984 when the Golf Mill Shopping Center, which owned the property, refused to renew their lease. The building was leveled, and the site is now part of the shopping center's parking lot. Michael Jackson had released his first solo song, Got to Be There, in October of 1971, with his debut solo album following in January of 1972. Shockingly, he didn't tour as a solo artist until February of 1988 for his Bad World Tour. Of course, he made plenty of appearances without his brothers before then, including in October of 1974 when he was the guest on Soul Train, which broadcast here on WBBM Channel 2. Appearing with Michael Jackson was a sister group from Ashtabula, Ohio, called MDLT. That's Maxine, Diane Laverne, and Tina Willis. The sisters had been signed to Joe Jackson's record label, Ivory Tower International Records, and were on Soul Train to perform Runnin' and Pushin' and What's Your Game. I bring this act up because, 1, I've never heard of them before. 2, I could find very little about them online, although there is a link to their Soul Train appearance in the show's notes. And D, Joe Jackson had a record label? June of 1975 saw the Jackson 5 perform 2 consecutive nights at the Chicago Stadium on West Madison to crowds of roughly 17,000 per night. They would return to the Chicago Stadium in November of 79, August of 81, and again in September of 1981. 2 years after their first appearance at the Mill Run Theater in suburban Niles, the Jackson Brothers returned to the venue in August of 1976 with their new name, The Jacksons. After switching from Motown Records to Epic Records, Motown sued to prevent them from using the name Jackson 5. Another change during this time was that Jermaine Jackson, who at that time was married to Hazel Gordy, the daughter of Motown founder Berry Gordy, stayed at Motown Records to start his solo career. The Jacksons' Monday through Sunday series of shows at Mill Run included 8:30 p.m. shows during the week, with 7 p.m. and 10 p.m. shows on Friday, and 2:30 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. shows Saturday and Sunday. According to Aaron Gold in his Chicago Tribune Tower Ticker column on opening night of the Mill Run shows, the screaming horde of teenage girls got so out of hand that the Jacksons couldn't take a curtain call or do an encore. And just to make some of you of a certain age feel really old, here goes. According to Gold, the fans mobbed the stage in a way that would put Tom Jones and Engelbert Humperdinck fans to shame. In April of 1979, the Jacksons performed another 5 nights at the Mill Run Theater in Niles, their final appearance there. Michael Jackson's album Thriller, released in November of 1982, catapulted him to an all-new level of superstardom. At its peak, the album was selling 1 million copies per week, and by October 30th, 1984, Thriller became the first album to be certified 20 times multi-platinum by the RIAA. Even with the success of Thriller, Michael reunited with his brothers for the Jacksons' 1984 Victory Tour, which brought them to Chicago to perform 3 sold-out shows on October 12th, 13th, and 14th at Comiskey Park, home of the Chicago White Sox. A reported 120,000 tickets were sold for those shows. In 1989, the Jacksons released their 16th and final studio album, 2300 Jackson Street, named after the address of their childhood home. With the exception of the title track, it was the group's first and only album produced without Michael and Marlon, both of whom left the group following the conclusion of their 1984 Victory Tour. For the recording of the song 2300 Jackson Street, Michael recorded his vocals at the Encino house that his family owned, and sister Janet Jackson recorded her vocals at Marlon Jackson's home studio. I realize I've not talked much about the daughters of Joe and Catherine Jackson. Oldest daughter Rebe got married young and moved to Arkansas. She later recorded the song Centipede, written and produced by brother Michael, which peaked at number 4 on the Billboard R&B chart in the fall of 1984. Rebe's connection to Chicago, as well as sister LaToya, is actually kind of thin. Youngest Jackson's sister Janet was 10 years old when she appeared on the TV show Good Times, set in an unnamed public housing project in Chicago, but filmed in California. She joined the cast of the sitcom for its 5th season in 1977, playing the role of Penny Gordon Woods. And yes, I know the opening and closing credits use footage of Chicago's Cabrini Green housing project, but they never say Cabrini Green. Fun fact, their fictional address was 721 North Gilbert Avenue, apartment 17C, which is actually kind of consistent with what was then Cabrini Green's location. Janet Jackson's 1993-1994 Janet World Tour in support of her eponymous 5th studio album, Ms. Jackson, came to the Chicago area twice, performing in December of '93 at the Rosemont Horizon, now known as the Allstate Arena, and returning the following summer for 2 concerts at Poplar Creek Music Theater in suburban Hoffman Estates on July 12th and 13th, 1984. Poplar Creek closed later that year. The Jacksons' connection to Gary, Indiana was once again highlighted in 1995 when the family contacted Gary officials with a proposal. According to a 2021 Post-Tribune article, Chuck Hughes, a Gary city councilman in the mid-90s, said, quote, "The Jackson family called us to say they'd like to do this huge endeavor in the city of Gary for the city of Gary," recalled Hughes. In December of 1995, a contingent of Gary officials traveled to meet with the Jacksons at their Encino home in California to discuss the project, a 232-acre development at the intersection of Interstate 94 and Interstate 65, with an anticipated cost between $2 billion and $5 billion, which would feature a Jackson's-branded theme park, a performance arts center, and a Jackson 5 family museum. It would be, quote, "bigger than Graceland," said Hughes. The project would be privately funded by corporate investors, not by city taxpayers or the Jackson family, Hughes said. A nonprofit foundation named the 6594 Foundation was also to be created to give back a percentage of revenue to the local community. "We had signatures of every Jackson family member except for Michael. This was all done with his blessing," Hughes said. The first wing of the Jackson 5 Museum was to feature the family's entire home, which is to be relocated from its original location. An adjacent museum would feature exhibits showcasing the steel mill industry and its Gary roots dating back to 1906. There appears to have been much finger-pointing as to why this project never came to be, but accounts claim the incoming mayor of Gary rejected the plans and the project stalled. On June 11, 2003, Michael Jackson traveled to Gary, Indiana, his first appearance in Gary in more than 30 years, to accept the key to the city from Mayor Scott King. The singer also pledged to help establish the Michael J. Jackson Performing Arts Center. The article in the Times newspaper in Hammond, Indiana, about Jackson's visit to Gary mentions that the mayor of Gary declined to give specific details about the site, cost, and start and completion dates for the Performing Arts Center. In a conference room on the second floor of Gary City Hall before a crush of cameras, Mayor King joked with the singer, quote, "Now that you have the key, you don't have to be a stranger." Michael Jackson's second stop was at his former home at 2300 Jackson Street, where he visited with his relative Tim Brown for 15 minutes, then greeted the nearly 1,000 fans who had gathered to see him. Jackson's motorcade then traveled to Roosevelt High School, where his older brothers attended before the band hit it big, for a raucous assembly in the auditorium in front of 800 students. Calling Jackson's appearance historic, school superintendent Mary Gwynn awarded the one-time King of Pop an honorary diploma for the occasion. That evening, while standing on a makeshift stage at center field at U.S. Steel Yard, home of the Railcats baseball team, Jackson told fans, "Gary, I am home." Standing at a lectern, the King of Pop went on to say, quote, "Gary will always have a special place in my heart. You're more than just a good friend. You are my family. I love you very much." While the crowd roared with approval, Jackson told them Gary, Indiana is the, quote, "soul of America." "I'm proud to be from Gary," Jackson said. The discussed performing arts venue named for Michael Jackson did not materialize before the singer's death in 2009. Ever the promoter, family patriarch Joe Jackson joined then Gary Mayor Rudy Clay in June of 2010 to announce plans to build the Jackson Family Museum and Hotel and Michael Jackson Performing Arts and Cultural Center and Theaters. hold on, let me catch my breath, near Interstate 80 and 94 on mostly golf and park property. Said Jackson, remember the song that says, I'm going back to Indiana, Indiana, here I come? Well, we are coming back, and we're bringing something back. The plans for the complex included hotels, restaurants, a golf course, retail stores, and housing. Mayor Clay estimated it would create thousands of jobs, bring at least 750,000 visitors per year to the area, and generate between $100 to $150 million for the community each year. The Jackson Foundation would also provide scholarships for students. While the mayor said the taxpayers would not fund the project and that it would be paid for by the Jackson Foundation and investors, 300 acres of land were transferred from the city to the Jackson Foundation. Missed deadlines and lack of progress plagued that project as well. Joe Jackson died at a hospice in Las Vegas on June 27, 2018, 1 month before his 90th birthday. He was surrounded by his wife and surviving children. 3 of the Jackson brothers, Tito, Jackie, and Marlon, continue to perform in the area, most notably at the Hard Rock Casino Northern Indiana in Gary, which they helped open with personal appearances in May of 2021 and performances in February 2022 and May of 2024. Tito Jackson died in September of 2024 at the age of 70. As the U.S. steel industry began to decline in the late 1960s and early 1970s, so did Gary, Indiana's fortunes. The decline of Gary, Indiana is often attributed to reduced demand for U.S. steel, which caused a drop in employment in the steel industry overall, resulting in U.S. Steel laying off many workers from the Gary area. While U.S. Steel Gary Works employed over 30,000 in 1970, that number declined to just 6,000 by 1990, dropping to 5,100 in August of 2015. As of September 2024, U.S. Steel reported that Gary Works employed roughly 3,700 to 4,000 workers. Historian S. Paul O'Hara points to other reasons for Gary's population decline in his 2011 book, Gary, the Most American of All American Cities. In it, O'Hara discusses the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the election of this country's first black mayor, Richard G. Hatcher, a position Hatcher held for 20 years for the ensuing white flight. According to the 2023 estimates, there are now fewer than 70,000 Gary residents. Although the Jackson family moved out of the small home at 2300 Jackson Street before the 1970s, family matriarch Katherine Jackson reportedly still owns it. It is closed to the public, but that doesn't stop thousands of visitors each year from making the pilgrimage to take pictures of the home from the sidewalk, trying to get a glimpse of where it all began. Thanks for listening to today's episode about the Jackson 5's Chicago connections. If you have any questions, anything to add, or just want to say hi, feel free to send me an email at chicagohistorypod@gmail.com. I have links to items related to this episode in the show's notes. Anything you buy through those links, not just the ones listed, may generate a small commission for this podcast at no additional cost to you. The art for most Chicago History Podcast episodes comes from my longtime friend John K. Schneider. Thanks, pal. If you need creative work done, John K. is the dude for you. Reach out to him at angeleyesartjks@gmail.com. I will be back soon with more stories from Chicago's history. Until then, get out and explore when possible. Learn more about whatever city you live in, and stay safe.